In 2011, a ducky shin cracker of a game blew us all away. Noire, they called it, and boy was it a gas. Real killer diller. You played as a flat-foot copper, solving capers and jitterbugging with mouthy broads. It was a real return-to-form adventure game with action gameplay in an open world. And it may look hairy by today's standards, but back then the graphics and facial animations were really ace. Hot diggity dog. Of course, the odd thing was that, for all its success, the eggheads behind the game and their studio, Team Bondi, crashed and burned harder than a Nazi dive bomber. Who could explain this crummy result? Did the team just run out of gas? Or did their controversial work practices net the kids a bum rap? At the time, like lots of rubes, I couldn't have cared less. I was happy to just enjoy my sparkly new game and drink my gin. What I've learned about the great LA Noire mystery since, boy, it really snaps my cap. I used to think, droopy-eyed boozehound I am, that this so-called crunch malarkey didn't concern me, no, not one bit. I thought, sure, it ain't politically correct to work round the clock and your own developers have to death, but who gives a flip? Well, listen here, Buster. That's just cockeyed crazy. This here's the straight dope behind the mystery of the phantom game company, Team Bondi. How their chrome dome fathead of a boss, Big Brendan McNamara, caused the crew to go belly up, and why crunch is the opposite of what I once believed. It may be politically correct in certain corporate circles, yet it's completely unnecessary, and can even damage the actual game. Take it away, Lee. In 2011, after 7 years of development, the world finally got its hands on Rockstar's much-anticipated 40s-era detective game, LA Noire. The game was indicative of the future of the industry, but perhaps in not all of the best ways. Today, a decade later, one word you hear a lot surrounding big releases like, say, Cyberpunk 2077 or Red Dead Redemption 2 is crunch. Crunch, as in chronic overwork by a dev studio in the process of finishing a game, is something I once believed, as I said, was just politically incorrect. I just thought it was socially unacceptable to admit doing it, but really nonetheless necessary for such big games as the ones that, well, have been made in the last 20 or so years. It was only by researching why LA Noire took so long, and essentially, despite the game itself's successes, caused its developer Team Bondi and its creator Brendan McNamara to both go down in flames, that I learned just how wrong about crunch I had been. Team Bondi began as Team Soho, the developers behind 2002's GTA rival, The Getaway. Soho were a studio under the brand of Sony Computer Entertainment, and from the get-go they established a brand of technical ambition, pseudo-realism, and cinematic flair. The Getaway was a British crime thriller, set in a, for the time, lifelike approximation of downtown London. The game honed an almost pretentious focus on realism, taking away the player HUD and filling the game with real firearm brands and setting-specific dialogue. Following The Getaway, which was a reasonable success at least in the UK, in 2003 Team Soho's key personnel relocated to Australia, where they founded the new studio Team Bondi. Led by The Getaway's director Brendan McNamara, the company convinced Sony to fund a new form of technology that would potentially change the way that all games in the future would be made. The Getaway had used a special in-house engine to produce its cutting-edge pseudo-realistic world. Sony had used The Getaway to challenge the Sega Dreamcast and help establish itself as a truly tech-forward company. This new proposed technology by Team Bondi, which would quickly cause the development costs for LA Noire to spiral out of control, was called Motion Scan. Motion Scan used 32 high-definition cameras in a 360-degree constellation to map an actor's face. Each camera cost about $6 grand a piece though, as they were the same cameras used, according to How Stuff Works, by NASA to record space shuttle launches. Not only is each camera very high definition, together, motion scan provides a level of image fidelity that no prior form of motion capturing can compete with, and it also captures minute facial animations without any need for a lot of manual animators. With the motion scan project to go, McNamara's vision for LA Noire seemed to be on track. Team Bondi began to think of itself as an industry leader, as a studio that anyone would and should be grateful to work for. Australia didn't have much of a games industry, and LA Noire was poised to be its biggest, highest profile release ever. If things went well, it could have marked the beginning of a new scene for the country, starting the first generation of AAA Australian game development. But the majority of devs who hadn't come over with McNamara from Team Soho were locals with little to no experience, and this was new technology that nobody really knew how to use. To make matters worse, McNamara styled himself as a so-called auteur, and in his interpretation of what that meant, the whole project would have to run top-down, with McNamara basically in charge of everything as its would-be dictator. This created a terribly inefficient workflow, as McNamara often bypassed his own studio leads to order changes directly, changes therefore that not everyone even knew about right away. Worse, McNamara seemed to think the best way to tackle such a daunting project was by making the devs feel personally responsible every time something went wrong, took too long, or didn't resemble enough of his precious vision. The devs would find themselves openly and angrily chewed out in front of everyone for any little issue, and soon McNamara and Team Bondi developed a bad reputation. When the project started failing to meet benchmark deadlines, it meant McNamara had less to show Sony to convey the massive investment in motion scan, and the trust that they had placed in him as director was all worthwhile. As technical setbacks got more and more in the way, McNamara started becoming even more of a slave driver. The policy for Team Bondi became one of more or less permanent crunch, and contracts were drawn up with exploitative, near sweatshop grade terms, which only guaranteed overtime pay, for example, at the end of the project, conditional on the employee remaining with the studio until the very end. The endless crunch required devs basically to forego not just weekends, but also evenings, and even decent sleep. To maintain momentum, Bondi's project leads essentially gaslit the entire team by constantly insisting the finish line was just around the corner, even when many of them knew full well that was a lie. That was the convenient excuse for why crunch was so desperately needed. Well, here's the thing about crunch. It burns people out. Good people, talented developers, who sometimes get so broken and disillusioned by the process they quit and never work in video games again. That was especially true in Noire's case, given how many of the staff were new to the industry. Brendan McNamara and his inner circle took these gifted, naive developers and crushed them down into nothing. The attitude was, you should be grateful to be crushed by us, to work for us on this historic project. If something went wrong, it isn't thanks to our mismanagement or our failure to anticipate the inherent challenges with such a game. It's thanks to you, your incompetence, your laziness, your selfishness, that the project's this brutally hard. Obviously, this approach to treating developers like meat for the grinding led scores of people to quit. And then when the new replacement staff found themselves now expected to catch up and basically do the job of 2 or 3 devs at a time, many of these quit as well. This fostered a full-blown crunch crisis, a cycle of crunch. And that is why LA Noire took 7 years to make. As a pathetic diss, Team Bondi left off from the game's final credits any dev who didn't stick it out with them until the end. But after only a year or two of work, back in 2005, Sony had actually dropped the project once they saw its budget spiraling out of control. The game only came out at all thanks to the rescue by McNamara's former rival, Rockstar Games. And pettily, McNamara, despite the fact that without Rockstar, LA Noire couldn't have been completed, seems to have despised their interference in his grand, all-important vision. McNamara did not at first approve of the casting of Aaron Staton as protagonist Cole Phelps, for example. According to an anonymous former employee, Team Bondi's management resented Rockstar full stop for taking over creative control. McNamara clashed with Rockstar on lots of things, even petty, small things like the game's logo, when trailers would be publicly revealed, and so on. Now, I can't prove this part, but if you look at the back of this cab you have to tail at different parts of the game, it really looks from a distance like the cab company logo is subliminally the Rockstar R with a line crossed through it. But that of course may just be a coincidence. When it comes to such a petty control freak like McNamara though, I wouldn't put it past him. What isn't a coincidence, however, is what happened to McNamara and Team Bondi after the game was complete. Though LA Noire itself was the first game in history to be presented at the Tribeca Film Festival and got showered with awards and praise, the studio was investigated by the International Game Developers Association for shoddy work practices, its relationship with Rockstar Games severed, its follow-up project, The Whore of the Orient, cancelled, and its great leader, McNamara, effectively exiled from the industry. Well, he always wanted to be the face of his work, and now he is. But like any good crime caper, the story doesn't end with the single perpetrator. Like the climate of violence, misogyny, racism, and hypocrisy portrayed by LA Noire, crunch is endemic. It's more than just the bad practices of a singularly loathsome man or studio. It is almost like a disease that's eating away at the heart of the entire games industry. To see just how crunch and developer exploitation harms not only the team, but your bottom line as the consumer, I'll leave you with this quote taken from a former Team Bondi employee who, out of fear of retaliation, had to remain anonymous. Quote, "We barely had any animators for such a long time it was crazy. People have mentioned how the open world in LA Noire is wasted because the world is so boring. The reason was because no animators wanted to work at Team Bondi. There was no lead animator from January 2008 until the end of the game. And for large parts of production, we only had one animator working on gameplay animations. Any others were doing cinematic animations. This meant that there was no way to add life to the world. It's a perfect example of why staff retention is important, how it was ignored by the leads at Team Bondi, and how the game suffered for it. Crunch is not only inhumane, immoral, and unsustainable, it directly harms the game it's being mandated to finish. Crunch creates a vicious cycle that will continue to play out over and over again, until this practice, like child labor or rampant industrial pollution, is someday brought under control. There are a million stories of crunch in the games industry, baby. This has only been one of them. Till next time, boss.